This is the brand new FMS FMT10, and this could be the most interesting 1/10 scale release we've seen in a long time. Let me show you why. First of all, as you can see here, this is a large 1/10 scale basher monster truck. It's similar in size to the V2 Max, as well as this Team Corrali Punisher 4. Unlike most bashers out there, this is a fully licensed body. This is a Chevy Colorado, and I think it looks really, really nice. To take a closer look at this body, we need to remove it, and to remove it, we need to use this unique clipless system. We've got buttons on both sides in the front and rear, and after pushing those, the body comes straight off. Underneath that, we have this really unique clipless system that the body mounts into. It's this tray system with these clips on the side and a little spring-loaded tab in the middle that pushes the body off when you push these clips in. This looks fairly similar to the clipless system they have on one of their crawlers, which I had a few issues with, and this looks like it really is going to collect dirt, so I'm curious to see how this works out. I hope it works out really well, because it is pretty cool. The body itself is nice thick Lexan. We've got a roll bar here in the back that attaches to this rear clipless system. The front part of the clipless system also attaches to a skid here in the front, and all of this feels very solid. The body itself also feels very thick and solid. We've got some scale Chevrolet detail here in the front, as well as in the back, and some hard lights in the rear, though these don't have any light bulbs in them. They do seem like they're set up to take light bulbs in both the front and rear. And then we've got some door handles here that appear to also have cable management on the inside. To go along with that, we've got a fairly large bumper in the front. These kinds of bumpers that stick out pretty far like this can be good or bad depending on how they're made. This one looks like it's made pretty well. And then in the rear, we have a wheelie bar that takes the place of a rear bumper. One thing I think that's going to set this thing apart from other 1/10 scale bashers are these tires. These things are absolutely massive. Underneath those tires, things look kind of familiar. We'll take a closer look at that in a minute. But first, these tires are on 17mm hexes. The wheels look pretty solid. They seem to be high quality. They're fairly stiff wheels, and they're of a design I've never actually seen before. The tires are also a design that isn't familiar to me. These wheels are vented, but the tires are not. And of course, they are foam filled. I'd say the rubber on these is medium hard, and they feel like a decent bashing tire. Of course, we'll only know once we go bash this thing. Like I said, for a 1/10 scale basher, these things are pretty large. We're talking 75mm wide and 146mm in diameter, making these only a little bit smaller than the D-Boots Copperhead LPs that are on the very large 1/10 scale V2.5 Arrma Creighton. Overall, these should give us good ground clearance and hopefully good traction. Like I said, these tires are on standard 17mm hexes. The nuts are serrated, which is really nice to see. These hexes are nice and thick, which means they should get good bite on the wheel. And the wheel doesn't have a bunch of offset, which means most of the width of this truck is actually coming from the arms. That's really nice to see. It means you can put different tires on here without losing the width of the vehicle. But it's behind those tires where things get really interesting, because this thing has some parts on it that look very similar to a bunch of different vehicles, and I'm kind of confused by it. These upper arms look very Arrma-like. These front hubs are very similar to Team Corrali. This radio box, which actually appears to be sealed, looks very similar to the MJX 10208 radio box. And then this looks like a giant Omni Terminator chassis. Put together, obviously, this is its own unique platform, but I suspect we're seeing a lot of different cars all coming from the same factory. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is an interesting observation. These shocks look really nice. They seem to be pretty beefy, especially for the size of this vehicle. We do have shock cap protectors, which again, look pretty familiar. These shocks are held into the arms with pins that are retained from the bottom. I think the pins are pretty cool, but I'm not a big fan of having these 1.5mm head screws, especially on the bottoms of arms, as these will inevitably get packed up with dirt, and that might be difficult to remove. This shock has a mostly aluminum construction. We've got an aluminum threaded body, aluminum spring collar, plastic lower perch, plastic lower shock eye, and then removing the shock cap itself, which wasn't so tight I had to use tools, which is nice. We can see we have a standard bladder style shock here, and the shock fluid is fairly thick, though I will say this shock body is thicker than I'm used to seeing. That is some nice thick aluminum. The shock piston is held on by a lock nut, not a clip. And again, that shock piston does look kind of familiar. The shock fluid FMS went with is very thick. I suspect this is going to be good for jump landing, but might compromise off-road handling ability. Again, that's just something we're going to have to find out when we bash it, because this is a brand new platform and I have no idea how this thing's going to run. Speaking of running, it looks like we've got a rebranded 10BL120 G2 4S ESC here from Hobbywing. That's coupled with a 4074 motor at 2000 kV, which is pretty low for 4S. I suspect this thing will handle 6S just fine. Again, we're going to find that out. And then we've also got a pretty fancy looking servo over here for an RTR. This thing's labeled as a Predator 35 kg. It has no labeling on the top, which means it was specifically made for this car to be upside down. We've got an aluminum slightly offset servo horn, and this is a design that I don't think I've seen before, so I'm definitely curious to see what's inside. But first, the way this is mounted is also interesting. As you can see here, there's no aluminum chassis plate. There's a full plastic chassis here, which is then being reinforced by this aluminum plate on the bottom. I'm sure someone else has done this, but I don't remember seeing it before. In order to get a closer look at the servo, first we're gonna have to disconnect some of this cable organization. These zip ties are really nice for keeping things neat and tidy, right up until you have to work on something, then it's all gonna get clipped off and maybe not put back together again. We've also got a cable organization tab here that I think will just rotate out of the way. Yes, that's really nice. It's got a little notch here that it locks into. That's a nice touch. Removing this cover gives us a first look at what appears to be a waterproof receiver box. We've got a little O-ring right here, seals for the wires, and a seal for the antenna tube. So yeah, they're at least trying to make this waterproof. Underneath that, we've got an FMS branded 6-channel radio link receiver. Controlling that is going to be a very familiar FMS branded transmitter. This is all the different adjustments you would expect, and a fairly basic design, though these do work pretty well. And coupled with this Hobbywing ESC, which we'll be taking a closer look at in a minute, I expect we're going to get good reception as well as good latency. One thing I'm not a huge fan of is this cable organization wrap. It looks really nice and it does do the job, but if you ever have to get anything like the servo wire out, it's really annoying to take off and it's probably not going to go back on. And with that removed, I think our servo wire is finally going to be free. We can see that waterproof grommet there. This grommet is sort of similar to the way that Arrma does it, though it has dedicated pass-throughs for each set of wires. I think that's kind of interesting because if you don't have a set of wires going through one of the pass-throughs, that's just going to be a hole. Now, taking a closer look at this servo, it looks surprisingly high-end for an RTR truck. We do have O-rings on the screws. That's really nice to see. I really do love to see nice servos on these RTRs. For way too long, we got in the habit of just replacing servos basically immediately, and I think having an RTR that you immediately have to replace stuff on really isn't something that we should be used to, and it's nice to see that most manufacturers are kind of going away from that. Now, popping this bottom cover off, we can see we do have a little O-ring here, and this is going to be a brushed motor. As you can see, there are only 2 contacts to it, but overall, this is a pretty nice looking servo. Would have been great if it had been brushless, but I wouldn't have expected it on an RTR truck like this. Now, removing the top cover, I'm going to try and do this without taking the servo horn off because I really don't want to lose the position of the servo horn. It seems like it's going to be a bit challenging to get it positioned properly given that it's upside down and there aren't any holes through the bottom of the chassis. So I get the feeling this is one of those ones where you're going to have to kind of guess on the servo horn position, and I don't really want to do that. Usually, if we're careful though, we can pop this apart and take a quick peek at the gears without having to take the servo horn off. Carefully pulling that up, we can see this gear train is actually different than most servos. It does appear to be an all-steel gear train, but the gears are kind of upside down from where I would expect them to be. This does look like it's going to be pretty solid though, and we do have a bearing up there at the top. Overall, this looks pretty good. Now let me see if I can get this back together without having to take that horn off. And the answer is no, I wasn't able to, and the reason is because this gear train's completely different from what I'm used to. This final gear is way thicker than normal. This thing could be a real tank of a servo. While we have that off, we can see there's just an O-ring for sealing here at the top. That is sufficient, though not ideal for waterproofing. I'd love to see an actual lip seal on here like we've seen in some other servos, but it should be just fine for general protection. One way you can kind of gauge the quality of a servo is just to move it back and forth by hand and see how smooth its movement is. This feels incredibly smooth. Again, I'm super impressed to see this on an RTR, and powering that servo is going to be this FMS branded 10BL120 G2 ESC, which is also really cool to see. Unfortunately, at least according to the manual, it doesn't look like we have the ability to set the BEC to 7.4 volts. That's a standard feature on the 10BL120. I'll hook up the programmer here in a few minutes and see if that's actually the case. Of course, this ESC also is going to be powering this big 1/8 scale motor, and to take a closer look at that, we need to take this tower-to-tower brace off. To do that, we need to remove these shock mounts, and the pretty comprehensive included tool bag does have a tool that looks like it'll work for that. And yeah, this should work, although having a longer wrench would probably be easier. It is nice that the included tools can get the job done. These upper shock mounts do look pretty stout. Again, though, we'll just have to wait and see how they hold up to some bashing. Hopefully they won't get bent or broken. And then it looks like we just got 2 more screws here. And then I think this will just lift right off. And that gives us our first good look at the shock tower, which appears to be a nice, thick machined piece of 6061 aluminum. Be nice to see this as 7075, but this does look pretty stout. And we also get a closer look at that body mount. As you can see, we've got push buttons on both sides that push these latches back, and then this spring-loaded button that pushes the body out. Again, my only concern with this is getting a bunch of dirt in here and jamming this mechanism up. Hopefully that's not going to be a problem. And now with that out of the way, you can see we have a little body pin here, and that's holding the pin in, which holds this center brace in, although it does still appear to be kind of captive. Maybe the other end needs to come off. So we'll go ahead and get this front body mount removed as well. I'm definitely curious to see how this bumper is going to hold up. It sticks out pretty far, which hopefully will be a good thing with plenty of flex, but it could also be a weak point. We'll find out. And now with that removed, hopefully we can get this center brace out of here. And it's actually still pretty tight, which means this chassis must be very stiff on its own because it doesn't want to bend out of the way. All right, we did get it popped out of there though. And these end mounts just push into this aluminum tube, which means this center brace will stop the chassis from flexing in, but not from flexing out. And now with that out of the way, we can get a closer look at this motor and ESC and fairly unique mounting system. As you can see here, the ESC is using 4mm bullets. That's a fairly common size for 4S ESCs, but not for 6S ESCs. So if you're gonna be upgrading to 6S, that's probably something you're gonna have to deal with. Now with those 4 screws off, we get our first look at the center differential, and it looks like a pretty beefy differential. It is still captive in here by this motor mount though, which should come loose with these 4 screws. With those out, this all comes apart. First thing we can see here is a nice beefy aluminum motor mount. Interestingly, it looks like the motor itself is mounted on slots on this mount. Yeah, so not only do you have slots here to adjust the mesh, but the entire motor mount to chassis interface itself is also slotted. This means you have 2 different places to adjust mesh. I've never seen that before. As you can see, these motor mounts encircle the motor. This makes for a very nice, strong mount that's supported in both the front and back. The downside of this is you're gonna be limited to a 40mm diameter motor because that's the diameter of the mount. I'm not sure if they're gonna offer different size mounts, but that is fairly limiting, though this is a pretty beefy motor for this car, so maybe we won't need to upgrade it. We do have a steel pinion gear here, and this front motor mount plate is aluminum, though there is a plastic insert for the center differential bearing. One thing I'm not seeing is very much in the way of thread lock on any of these screws that are going into aluminum. Maybe FMS knows something I don't, so we're just gonna leave the thread lock off here and see how it goes. The front and rear center drive shafts look really nice. They've got that same familiar goldish brown coating on them, and they neck up to a thicker diameter in the middle. They are, however, still thinner on the ends, and that's so they can still clear the output cups on the center differential. Having the middle thicker definitely does strengthen it, but it leaves weak points on the ends where it can still bend. And for the rear, we just have a tiny version of the same thing. This center differential looks really nice. This is a machine spur gear. And then opening this up, we can see we have sintered steel internal gears. This is very thick center differential fluid. I'm guessing it's probably 1 million, if not a little bit thicker. And then pulling this out, we can see that the cross pins are also steel, and there are steel backers behind the spider gears. This is nice to see because it reinforces the area where it pushes up against the plastic housing and should make it both stronger and stiffer. Like I said, this housing is plastic, though it seems pretty thick, and these output cups appear to be well made, and it's holding in these sealed bearings. I love to see sealed bearings everywhere because those are better for bashing. And speaking of sealed, we do have a gasket on here, so these are sealed differentials. Even though the fluid in this looks pretty thick, I'm gonna add just a dab of some Traxxas 20 million in there. I found that most of the time, the center differential just isn't quite stiff enough for my needs. One of the questions I get most often is why a center differential is such an advantage in a bashing vehicle. Its main purpose is to decouple the front and rear ends of the drivetrain. Power goes in through this spur gear and is put out through the output cups. But because of the internal gearing, these output cups can actually spin at different speeds, meaning they're not locked together. In a car without a center differential, the front drivetrain and rear drivetrain have to spin at the same speed. So for instance, if I roll the back tires, the front tires also have to roll. This means if you're coming in and landing a jump and the wheels are spinning, when the back tires hit the ground, they're gonna have to stop. And without a center differential, the front tires also have to stop. That means all the force of stopping those front tires is transferred through the entire drivetrain, which can be really hard on things. Having this differential in the center means the front and rear are decoupled from each other, which alleviates that to some degree. The main disadvantage of this is that more power could be sent to the front or the rear, meaning under heavy acceleration, when the front wheels come off the ground, all the power could get bled off to those front wheels, which is when you end up with big pizza cutter front wheels under heavy acceleration. That's why we run really thick center differential fluid. It still allows things to be decoupled, but helps prevent that big ballooning of the front tires under heavy acceleration. Now, speaking of differentials, let's see how easy it is to get to these front and rears. With this car, FMS seems to be relying more on pins than any other RC car I've ever seen before. This has its advantages and disadvantages. The main disadvantage being that we have a lot of little tiny screws to deal with. The main advantage being that pins are going to be inherently stronger than screws because they don't have to have threads on them. Interestingly though, this pin feels pretty light. I think this is aluminum. aluminum. Yep, that's non-magnetic. That's an aluminum pin. With that pin out of there, we can fold this wheelie bar out of the way, but I don't think it's going to give us access to what we need, so we need to go ahead and pull the skid plate off the bottom as well. The screws holding on the skid plate are really interesting. They're these thick washer-headed screws. They've got really small 2mm hexes in them. Manufacturers usually try to avoid this sort of thing as it's more expensive, but FMS really seems to be embracing it on this car. With those 4 screws out, we get the skid plate off, and I think that's also going to release the entire rear module, though it is still being held in place by this fairly complex tower to chassis brace. And with those removed, this rear module should come right out of here. And there we go. As you can see, the arms are being held in with really nice machined A, B, C, and D blocks, but the arm pins are being retained in another unique way. You need to be really careful with these screws. These tiny heads can get stripped out really easily, and these do appear to be thread locked in. If you strip one out, you're not going to be very happy. With that little screw removed, we can actually move this retention plate over. As you can see, it's in a keyed slot, and that prevents this pin from moving both forward and backward. Definitely an interesting retention style, and I'm curious about its long-term durability. All right, here's another really interesting choice. These bolts go all the way through to the front. This reminds me of the M2C system for the Arrma blocks. This is going to be very strong, but a little less convenient for disassembly. This through bolt design means you have to have access to this nut, and without removing the module, you don't have that access. So in order to get the differentials out, you're going to have to take the module out of the truck. And with those 4 screws out, this should just come apart. And here we have the rear differential. And wow, guys, this thing looks like an absolute unit of a diff. These gear teeth are significantly larger than what I'm used to seeing even on 1/8 scale vehicles, and has a matching fully machined pinion gear. Internally, I expect this to look similar to the center differential. And yeah, this basically looks the same. It looks like they're using a bit thinner fluid, though it is thicker than on a lot of cars. And again, just look at the teeth on that gear. That's a really nice looking gear. They are spiral bevel, which means we're going to have more constant tooth engagement, which should be both stronger and quieter. Finishing up our tour of the rear end, we do have CVDs in the front and rear. That's nice to see. However, these CVD pins are retained by these spring clips. On other brands, I've seen these spring clips allow the pins to get spit out. Whether or not that's going to happen here, we'll just have to find out. We do have nice, thick, adjustable upper links, and these hubs look relatively generic, but pretty stout. The arms themselves appear to be nicely designed, and they are medium flexible. How these survive bashing, of course, we're just going to have to find out. Speaking of finding out, I'm getting really excited to see what this thing can do. Let me get all this put together, and we've got just a couple more things to look at, then we're going to go bash. As I was putting this together, I came to an interesting realization. Because the motor and center differential are located by this plate, the pinion to spur gear mesh is only going to be set by these small slots. The slots in the chassis don't actually do anything because this bearing is also located in this plastic piece here. Unless I'm missing something, that means the only adjustment you're going to have is in these 2 little slots, which is going to be pretty limiting for what kind of pinions you can run. Another cool thing I noticed is that the back end of the upper hinge pin mounts in the front are also supported by machined aluminum, and the steering rack down here looks really, really nice with a machined aluminum Ackerman bar. All right, guys, we are almost there. We've got 2 more things to do, and they both have to do with the ESC. The first one's going to be to get rid of these XT60 connectors. This is a 120 amp ESC with a pretty big motor, and I don't think 60 amp connectors are going to cut the mustard. So we're just going to toss a single XT90 on there instead. I'm honestly not really sure dual connectors really make sense anymore. Back in the day when 4S cars first came out, and especially when 6S cars first came out, people really didn't have individual 4 and 6S batteries, so they would give you dual connectors so you could run your standard 3 and 2S batteries. But these days, a single 6S battery is about the same price as 2 3S batteries, and the same goes for 2S and 4S batteries. A single 4S battery is also easier to manage, especially in a low profile battery tray like we have in this car. And now the last thing I want to do is verify that we can program this 10BL120 with a standard Hobbywing programmer and make sure it's fully unlocked. With the program card plugged in, let's turn this on. And going through the items, it looks like we only have 5 options. And the manual does confirm that. So yeah, unfortunately, even though this is a 10BL120 G2, some of its functionality, including BEC voltage setting, has been removed from it. I'm honestly not sure why manufacturers do this. Maybe they can get them cheaper from Hobbywing if they have fewer options, but I think we would like to have all those settings available. But enough talking, it's time to go see what this brand new FMT10 can do. All right, guys, first pass with this brand new platform. Let's see how she does. Pretty stable so far, surprisingly stable for a monster truck. Full throttle. Yeah, she's stable. Not the fastest thing in the world, but honestly, with that low KV motor, I'm not surprised. It almost seems like they were originally planning for this thing to be 6S, and then they decided to make it 4S at the last minute. I'm definitely curious to see how this does on 6S, but at least on 4S, it's very stable and actually feels really, really good. Again, it's not the fastest thing in the world out of the box, but it feels like a great handling RC car. Let's see how fast that was. All right, 40 miles an hour. Will it do a wheelie? Oh yeah, oh, it holds a nice wheelie too. This thing actually feels really good. Look at that. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button to let me know. That way I know to make more videos like this. I love doing these kinds of teardowns, and I love having you join me for them. Well, that was quite the little rollover. Overall, it does feel pretty good. I think the tires are probably gonna let the rest of this thing down, though at least on grass, they do feel pretty nice. They've got decent traction, but not so much traction that it immediately wants to traction roll. Grass, of course, is a pretty easy terrain to bash on. This kind of really rough gravel over here is much more difficult, and I've seen quite a few cars really struggle on this area, and so far, this thing seems to be doing reasonably well. It's a little bouncier than I thought it was going to be. It might need a little bit of shock tuning, but overall, for what it is, it does feel pretty nice. Moving over to a combination of gravel and dirt, again, it handles well, and I really like that it doesn't try to roll over when you really give it the beans in a turn. It stays nice and flat. Those sway bars probably have a lot to do with it. A lot of monster trucks don't have sway bars. This one does, and it definitely helps keep it flat when you're turning. And so far, this thing feels really friendly for general level ground bashing. Of course, being a monster truck, you want it to be able to handle some rough stuff too, and we've got some nice deep sugar sand here that it again seems to be handling reasonably well. It's a little bit floaty and bouncy, but once again, for a monster truck, it seems to be pretty well composed. This feels more like a truggy than a monster truck, and other than the body, it really is designed more like a truggy. It's got a fairly low center of gravity chassis, and with those sway bars, it definitely handles pretty darn well. Let's see how composed it stays with a high-speed rough dirt pass. Again, pretty good, although having lower power like we do here with only being 40 miles an hour top speed on 4S, it's gonna be a bit easier to stay composed. When you've got crazy 6S power on a platform that's similar in size to this, if not a little bit more, it definitely makes it harder for the truck to keep itself together over rough terrain, and it makes it easier to get upset, but still, this thing is handling very, very well. I'm really impressed with it. Of course, to be a successful 1/10 scale basher, it's gonna have to be able to jump. And it jumps okay so far. We'll be doing some more durability testing once we put more power to it, but let's see if we can get a good backflip out of it. Yeah, even with the lack of wheel speed from that lower 4S power with that low KV motor, we're getting enough wheel speed to get a good rotation in the air. And the brakes work pretty well too. Get a couple more of those jumps out of her. Nice big backflip. Nice. Yeah, it feels pretty darn good. Let's see how fast we can go. Get a real run up here. Go right over my head. Oh, and it looks like we broke the front bumper. This actually isn't a big surprise, and it's not a big deal because I've already got a replacement from FMS. Apparently they had some issues with the very first batch of these. Looking up close, as you can see, there are some voids in this plastic. These sorts of early teething problems are why we test these trucks out before you guys get your hands on them. This bumper and a few other bits and pieces will already have been updated on the truck that you buy, so let me get this thing on and let's take it off the big ramp. Now we've got some pretty tall grass out here, but fortunately these big tires can handle it. Lands pretty nicely. This thing does handle in the air well. Doesn't really have the wheel speed to get up for a big backflip though. Can do one, not too bad. I think once we go to 6S, that wheel speed's definitely going to increase nicely. This thing does have a fairly low KV motor, so I'm not super surprised that it doesn't really like the backflip, but it does a pretty decent job. Hit that arm pretty hard there and took it. That was nice to see. And it is handling this tall grass very well. Full backflip, right on the nose. I wonder if that front bumper survived. Yep, looks good. I guess that updated part fixed it. Nice big jump here. Backflip. Oh, right back on that front bumper. It does like to land on its wheels. That's nice to see. Let's go over the head. There we go. This thing lands pretty nicely. Seems to handle really well. Yeah, these big tires and this larger car, this is basically what I would expect a 1/8 scale car to have been about 10 years ago. So being 1/10 scale, it definitely is big and feels awesome. Big backflip, nice. Lands well, likes to land on its wheels. Yeah, so far this thing feels great, but we've got a 2000 kV motor in this, so let's see what it does on 6S. Going to 6S is probably the best way to get better wheel speed, and that's because of a quirk that I recently found out about this. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But for now, we're gonna slap this Castle Cobra 10 in here. This truck is a little bit overweight for this ESC, but I think it can handle it, and it's the right size for the connectors on the motor. This also gives us an opportunity to see how our sealed up receiver box is doing, and not too bad so far. Also get this 4S battery out of here. I'm using SMC, of course. Let me know if you want to see SMC batteries in the big giveaway we're going to be doing. And of course, make sure you're subscribed, because if you're not, you're going to miss out on that awesome giveaway when we hit 50K. One nice thing I've noticed is that this ESC is held in with screws as well as double-sided tape. Unfortunately, those screw holes won't line up for the Castle Cobra, so we're going to use some VHB. Speaking of which, let me get this ESC installed. We'll put a 6S battery in this truck, and I'll see you outside. All right, fully charged 6S battery. Let's see what this thing can do now. Obviously, this test is going to be a little bit different than an off-road test, but it's what we've got. Full throttle. Woo, that's fast. Okay, that's a lot faster. Still pretty stable though. Full throttle. Yeah, that is quick. Let's get one more pass. Really ballooning those tires. Full throttle. Still end up on its wheels. Let's see what we got. 50 miles an hour, that's a nice improvement. That's gonna give us the extra wheel speed we need to really get rotating in the air too. Oh yeah, she's really responsive now. This thing should have been 6S out of the box. She's pretty wild now. Oh, missed the ramp. Let's try that again. See if we can get a triple. Nope, just a big single, and she's on her back. Can she flip over on her own? Self-riding. That's a good one. Those tires are really ballooning, but they seem to be holding in pretty good. See if we can get a good double. Triple right on the nose. Yeah, guys, she is definitely more lively on 6S. Lots of rotation out of those big ballooning tires. Yeah, this is fun. There we go. Did we get some big air out of her? Oh, right on the roof. We're definitely doing some durability testing now. She's off. Well, guys, it looks like, unfortunately, I was wrong. This Cobra 10 had plenty of power, but unfortunately, it melted one of its terminals right off the circuit board, so we were overloading it, which I knew we were doing, because this truck weighs about 50% more than they rate the ESC for on Castle's website, so it is my fault. One thing I noticed though is that it doesn't seem like a regular 1/8 scale ESC is gonna fit in here without modification. You could trim the chassis, but this little piece right here prevents it from sitting all the way flat. There probably are some normal 6S ESCs that'll fit, but you might be relegated to 4S in most cases. That could be a little bit of a problem because unfortunately these gears are mod 0.9. You can see right here that's how they're specified in the manual. And other than in this truck, mod 0.9 gears don't seem to exist. Not really sure why they didn't just go with mod 1. And for them to fix this would be pretty easy. They just need to make a spur gear in mod 1 instead of mod 0.9. But unfortunately, there really isn't anybody that makes mod 0.9 gears for this, so you are kind of stuck with the gearing that comes with it. With that being said, I am pretty impressed with this truck overall. The servo's great. The motor is definitely oversized for the truck and handles it really, really well. Most of the drivetrain is oversized. It comes with sway bars. I really didn't have any problem with this quick release body mount, which I was afraid I was going to. And even though on camera and off camera, this thing took some pretty heavy hits, everything looks straight and is still together. Even the body's held up pretty well. We've got a couple of marks here in the front and in the back from stress, but overall not bad for having taken several hits on the roof and front and back ends. That front bumper also held up just fine as well. So what's the catch? Well, this is a brand new truck from FMS, which means you're not going to get a ton of upgrades for it right away. Spare parts are going to be limited to where you can get FMS spare parts from, and quirks like that mod 0.9 gearing and lack of space for the ESC make upgrading a little bit more difficult than it should be. Overall though, this thing's 470 bucks, and for that price you do get a lot of truck. And if you don't mind the limitations that come with it, this is a really cool RC, looks really nice. I do like the licensed body, and seems reasonably priced, especially in today's day and age. You know what else is reasonably priced? One of these videos, which are absolutely free to watch.